Well, welcome everyone to the next episode of HR Tech Chat. And we have with us today as our guest is Jennifer Ravalli, who is Vice President of Marketing at PandoLogic. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thanks, Brent. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Yeah. We had an awesome conversation. It's crazy to think that it was actually 2 months ago now, but at HR Tech Conference, the virtual one in the spring, we had a fantastic conversation, and you went through a lot of what you folks are doing at PandoLogic, and we ended up getting into if I recall correctly, a pretty philosophical conversation, I think, around how AI and machine learning and NLP and all that stuff, right, is really going to affect and have a massive impact on what talent acquisition is like in the I'd say now not too distant future, although it's not tomorrow. Some of it's here already, but some of it's kind of science fiction, seems science fiction, but as with so many other things in today's world, we're pretty close to the science fiction at this point. So where would you like to start?
I think really, it's a really interesting discussion. And to me, it's all about data-fueled change and really seeing that data take shape in talent acquisition overall and in the life of a recruiter. I think this is a very similar transition to what you saw in marketing 10 years ago, where things really went from being very gut instinct led to being extremely data driven now. Everything from not only where you advertise or how you seek out the right client profile, but even, the creative process has gone very much to kind of a data-driven model. And I think you're seeing the same thing happen in the talent acquisition space today. And really a lot of early adopters have taken to this very well in terms of bringing AI, natural language processing and machine learning into their recruitment process. But there's still a lot of ways to go in terms of adoption there. And I think a lot of that really comes from fear and, kind of a fear of loss of control, kind of with kind of having data kind of take you to those places. But I think a lot of that's going to start to change very quickly, particularly with kind of job ad recovery on the rise. And what's really also very interesting now is, we're seeing that, jobs are picking up, but people are having a really hard time getting the talent they need right now. And, a lot of that has to do with, certainly dynamics, fear of change for the job seeker, as well as just being able to, think about, whether they want to take the risk at this point, given kind of where we are. But I think it's really hitting a pivot point where people need more data, they need more AI and machine learning fueled tools in order to get to that talent that they really need to kind of bring to the table. So it's very interesting time right now, but I think that transition point is really starting to happen. And a lot of that has to do with the data that's now available and the ability to be able to take that and learn from it on an ongoing basis.
I can't imagine having to handle or adjust to the coming tsunami of job applications if we were in the 70s right now, right?
Exactly.
That's always my reference point is what was it like in the 70s versus now, right? And that's where you get your real contrast is, AI, can you give us, there's so much in what you just shared. I have several questions. I don't want to forget them as we talk about the things in order here, but what I'd love to, what I'm curious about right now, first is, can you give us an example of how the AI, well, I'm just going to go off on a super mini rant right now.
Sure.
Just an aside, AI is often used as kind of an umbrella term for some things that aren't necessarily AI, but are very sophisticated and useful. For instance, machine learning, natural language processing, this, and then you have, real like artificial intelligence. And some of this stuff is kind of lower level, but it's still very sophisticated. So with that in mind, with these newfangled, far more sophisticated computing capabilities, how is that helping right now?
Sure. So I'm trying to think of a really good example. How we can really think about, I'm going to use sourcing actually as an example.
Okay.
Most recruiters make decisions kind of, hey, like, I know based on my prior experience that this job is hard to fill or easy to fill. Is it something I should advertise, or is it something I can do on my own? And if not, they kind of have preferential places that they may want to place those ads. And this is definitely a very personal example, kind of given what we do, but I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about. But that series of decisions that recruiter or sourcer makes has a huge impact on the outcome. And often they're very fraught with bias and use a fairly limited scope of data. When we introduce AI into that equation, we can really streamline those decisions. The application of AI is really around the decision making of being able to kind of change on a dime, make those decisions very quickly, and leverage that data that it's learning from to be able to continue to change and adapt that reasoning. So when we introduce that AI into the equation, we can streamline, and we can also make those decisions much faster and on a much larger scale. So if we were to evaluate those jobs at PandoLogic, we would look at them. We do something called a predictive performance report, which basically, before we ever spend a dime, we say, based on all of our data of over 10 years of being in the programmatic market, supply and demand, et cetera, we're actually pulling in all of that data to say, actually, this job is much harder to fill than this one. So here's where you should place your dollars. And you need to be placing it in a variety of places in order to be able to get to those candidates and meet them where they are. And what's very interesting is, while most of the time folks would advertise maybe in 3 or 4 places, we have over 1,000 places that we're placing those jobs based on where we see that talent residing, and based on real-time data that we're making a decision to place an ad, remove an ad, or actually impact the cost in order to be able to get that best outcome. And so when we apply that philosophy, we're able to actually save around 30% of what they would invest normally in order to get that candidate. So those are some of the real life applications of AI that can really see tremendous results and also help to attract a larger scope of candidates than maybe that recruiter's individual decisions might make on their own.
That's really interesting. And so a couple of things. So we're talking about a fundamental, well, let me back up a little bit here. So you look at recruiting as a profession, right? Mm-hmm. And a recruiting professional, a really good recruiting professional, they've sort of developed, for lack of a better term, just to keep this moving right now, a sixth sense, mm-hmm. or kind of like just an intuition, or or we could even say just sort of a fine understanding of the types of roles that they work with and the company that they work for, right? And so they've developed this over time, and some recruiters perform better than others, and you could argue that might be one of the reasons, right? But what you're talking about is kind of this is a strong word, and I'll use it anyway. It's kind of a usurpation of that, right? It's so you have a recruiter that has an intuition for, or believes very strongly that they have an intuition for what is needed to fill a certain role, and you could apply, I mean the royal you could apply AI to that, right? And come up with a completely different conclusion, and this is where you're kind of changing, this is where the recruiting, I think, maybe loses some of its some of the art of it, right? Okay, so how do you see recruiting, the profession of recruiting, evolving to adapt to live side by side with this AI, because some of what you're talking about, that was the word I was looking for, is the art of recruiting. Was there an art in the first place, right? Or was it just kind of just did the recruiter think there was an art to it, but maybe there wasn't? Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a huge believer in the balance of art and science, particularly coming from a marketing background. Certainly like my ability to craft messaging to be able to get to that right person at the right time, is a lot of art, but then validated by science, right? And I think that that's where we're going to see recruiting go as well. You still need instinct when it comes to talking to that candidate and being able to, place that right person that's going to be a true cultural add to the organization. But when we think of a lot of the work that AI should be doing at times or could be doing for them, it's often in the places where it's more areas where they may not want to be spending a lot of their time.
Okay.
And I think that's a big difference. I think there's a fear of AI that it's going to take away jobs and being able to, kind of to replace people. But that's really not kind of where I believe AI is going. It really should be more of a companion, similar in marketing. There are different roles now. You focus on different things than maybe you did 10 years ago when you didn't have AI to help you. But when you think about having that AI, particularly I'd say at the front end of the process, it allows you to really have that recruiter focus on what is truly that more human mission, which is, once you kind of start to get that initial field of candidates, making sure that you're, getting the right person in the role, having a really strong candidate experience to support that. It's interesting. We as talent acquisition, as a group, right, the royal we of the industry, talk a lot about candidate experience and different loops and things of that nature. But when we're actually doing some work now around kind of job seekers and how they're really feeling in their sentiment, and there's some more really great stuff to come, but like high level, like they don't see it the same way we do. And if we were to think about where a recruiter can spend their time, it's really honing in on providing that, support to the candidate, making that candidate experience really personalized and bringing them through for both the hiring manager and the candidate, versus some of this work that kind of drives the initial kind of pool. The other thing is, also in thinking about, driving more diversity into the workforce. If you don't source for that in the first place, like you're not going to end up with a clean slate of candidates that may represent a really diverse population, and technology can really help eliminate bias in that area. So I think it's really should be about working hand in hand, and being able to take the benefit of the AI on the front end, but then take that magic that the recruiter brings to the table, that art, that gut, that instinct, to really put that perfect person in the hands and deliver them safely to the hiring manager to really impact the business.
Yeah, oh, I love that. Because that's what it comes down to. That there's a need for a human interaction there for the business task at hand to feel satisfying to all the stakeholders involved. So there's that human interaction that I think that is necessary. And so what you just described, this is going to make sourcing folks who focus on sourcing as their role. This is going to make them very, very efficient. And it has occurred to me that what you're describing is essentially, we'll just use the word automation, because there's really kind of, I think, a different word for it. I've heard it as there's terms for it that I've heard that are escaping me at the moment, something around process, but we're talking about the automation of much more complex processes than, we have automation of, like payroll processing and other things. That's very essentially lower level automation. We've almost, completely won the game when it comes to that lower level automation. Not everybody has the tools, but the tools that can do it exist. right? Whereas what you're talking about is again, I'm using automating as a placeholder term here, but you're talking about automating much higher level, more sophisticated, complex processes, workflows. In the decision making is the other thing that I wanted to make sure that we hit on here. That really struck me. You're improving or assisting or neither of those is necessarily the right word here either, but you're enhancing the decision making that they would make to make it more accurate or more applicable or pertinent, make the result more pertinent. And that is that's something that's occurred to me previously in my own writings on the blog at 360 Insights, is this idea that AI is, well, we talk about human decision making. Let's look at, because I want to get into job descriptions too, because we talked a lot about that, but okay, I'm a human, all right. I write my own CV, or maybe I hire someone else to write it for me, or to provide heavy input into my own writing of my CV, right? It's humans involved, it's our best guess, sort of an analog for pure objectivity in terms of understanding of my own career. I mean, I have an opinion, a bias about my own career. It doesn't even have to be, for anybody. That opinion, that bias doesn't have to be particularly arrogant or anything like that. It's just a bias. I look back on my career, and from my perspective, I think that A, B, and C are relevant, and X, Y, Z might not be as relevant, right? And again, furthermore, I'm looking at my credentials and sort of my experience and my expertise versus not necessarily, recognizing my soft skills or talking about those in my CV. So my CV is just wrought with just these biases, and I don't want to say inaccuracies, because that's not the word, but these biases are this information that may not be relevant to the role that is open, right? And then when I'm an organization writing a job description, it's kind of the same thing. As an organization, I think I have an idea that I may be very emotionally attached to, that I think this particular open role needs, right? And that may not, it's really a shot in the dark. Well, it's a little bit better than a shot in the dark, but it's certainly not nowhere near as accurate or as objective as an AI would be in sort of looking at the data, right? If you have a large enough data set. Sorry, I'm ranting here, but I love this topic. It's just that AI with a large enough data set of data around that particular kind of role would be able to develop or provide heavy input into the development of a job description that would, ultimately be much more objective and relevant to the actual needs for that role, for that organization. So we have two things. We have the CV that's maybe irrelevant. It may be, it's not inaccurate, but it's irrelevant, right? Potentially very much so. The same thing for the job description. So we're sort of the blind leading the blind, and that's what we've been doing forever, right? And it's not that we certainly haven't failed, because we have hired people, I'm talking in aggregate, in all of industry over decades of time. We've hired plenty of people that did a great job, and plenty of people didn't do a great job. It's been, that's just been the reality of it. And now we're talking about potentially completely different scenario. So with that backdrop, and I'm sorry, I think I went on too long there, but let's talk about job descriptions for a moment here. Or what's your reaction to that?
I'm super excited to talk about this. I had like a million thoughts coming through my mind as you were sharing. So first of all, I think the resume angle is really interesting, because I don't think anybody has even thought to solve that yet. And there's a lot of opportunity there. I know personally, I was thinking about myself, and when I look at my CV, how do I look at it? And what I always find is I downplay a lot of things that I've done, right? Which is a very female trait. Oh, can I really take credit for that? Was that really my work? And I actually, in one point when I was interviewing for a job years ago, I used a lot of we, and the hiring manager, who's actually probably my biggest sponsor overall in my career, was like, well, you used we a lot. Like, tell me what you did specifically. And I'm like, these are all things that I led, and yet I am almost making them less. Granted, that means that I support the fact that I work with a team and that we don't get work done entirely on our own. But really, you see that very much come through, particularly when you look at the difference in how women create resumes and how men create resumes, and also how they respond to job descriptions. So those two things really do go hand in hand. One interesting thing, in particular, when we think about the use of AI in recruiting, and I think NLP as well, is really when we say throw away the resume, and when we start to do things through conversational AI to get people to talk about themselves in different ways than they may have if they were simply putting together a resume and thinking about their accomplishments, their achievements, and their credentials. But really talking about what they did, what lights them up, and what excites them about what they're looking to do next. So I think that there's some really interesting work to be done, particularly on the resume. But there's certainly some movement using conversational AI. Not that it's perfect yet, but I think it helps. And then as we think about how we store that information, and maybe a little bit crazy, and as we've thought about kind of very much into the future, how that information that we're sharing through those avenues becomes more of a profile for the job seeker, and how they can kind of move forward in their careers using the things that they've shared, when they're not sharing them to be on a piece of paper, but in having a conversation. So I think that there's a lot to be done there, and maybe that's my next job, is creating the company that does that. But
I'm going to found that company before you. All right. So I just realized I let the cat out of the bag here. Great stuff. So, the Velocity Network Foundation does some stuff around this, and wouldn't it be interesting? Now we're talking far out stuff, but I could see it happening. Is you had to maybe each individual, in an increasingly gig-like economy in the future, right? And that's a whole rabbit hole I won't get into right now because we don't have enough time. But it's a day-long conversation. But you have individuals in the future who have an AI assistant or companion. You could call it an AI companion. That maybe that's a little creepy, but we'll say an AI assistant, or an AI prosthetic, right? That helps them. They're working so many gigs, so many projects at such a high velocity, just from one project to the next, right? And you have the AI that's determining who's best for the next projects, right? And so you have, as an individual, you have an AI program that's constantly recompiling your background to present to the project in need your potential relevance for that project, right? And that's something that at some point, look, not 10 years ago, about 8 years ago, I transitioned from being a consultant. I was doing contract work with all sorts of people, to one of the large vendors in the space, basically gave me an offer that I could not refuse, in a good way, not in the Godfather way. But anyway, and so I had to compile my CV. I had to go back and all these projects and figure out, and it had to be, they wanted something kind of exhaustive, and then of course the background check was an absolute, that was I don't want to say nightmare, because it was all positive. I was hired and all that, but that was a real crazy process going through the background screening as well, right? Because I had to go back and figure out all this stuff that I hadn't thought to keep track of at the time, because I never thought it was going to be relevant. And so I'm glossing over it a little bit, but the whole point is that it would have been nice also to have had a blockchain kind of just
Pull it all in.
track of all of that
Mhm.
too. So the future, I think, and I was sort of inferring from something you said previously, just a moment ago, was inferring blockchain. I didn't know if that's maybe what you meant, but yeah, blockchain and AI, I think is going to be huge. And maybe this is, what role do you think? This I wasn't expecting that we'd get into this today, but psychometrics, what role do you think those will play in this sort of hypothetical, not so hypothetical future?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I think we're seeing a lot of that. And I think this will also apply very much when it comes to behavior and the job and reacting to, I want to make sure we get to job descriptions as well. But
Yeah.
when you look at behavior, and it was funny, we were meeting with someone, and as we were showing them our platform, one of the things that we do is extrapolate job descriptions into more common language using specific variables. And what that then shows is the behavior of an applicant and what they respond to and what they don't, right? And when we think about bringing behavior into evaluation for a job and things of that nature, I think that there's been a lot of work there. And I think some folks have bought in, and some folks have not. But we look at that from a marketing perspective with such detail in terms of, if you can get to psychometrics in being able to build a profile of your customer, this is very relevant in healthcare. When you think of, particularly people who are, more advent to take risks versus others, right? And being able to then build that profile using data and using the AI to build that, you're able to make really much better decisions about the placement of those potential employers or members that you're bringing into, per se, a health plan, right? So very similarly, when we think about people who are taking risks, who are willing to take risks in a job, whether or not they make sense in a startup environment versus a more stable environment, like these are all really great tools to be able to add to kind of look at the value of the well, I would say, I hate to say fit of a position, because I really think you should always look at candidates as how are they going to add to your organization versus fit in your organization. But really kind of profiling out and understanding how that person is going to add value in terms of the way that they make decisions and the way that they behave in certain scenarios. And I think that there's a lot of work being done in that area, but I'm not necessarily seeing a lot of people pick that up in terms of it, except maybe potentially towards the end of a process, when it's down to kind of two specific candidates and trying to kind of make a decision between them. But I think we can do a lot there probably in the future in terms of as we build those and curate those profiles. Whether through kind of the language that they're providing and then attaching that through blockchain, or as well as through kind of assessments and things later on in the process.
Yeah, all great stuff. And you know what? Again, that goes back to something you were saying earlier around. I think that you said, quote, I think that we can, I'm paraphrasing, I think that we can apply AI to the front end of the process in recruiting to really help the recruiter be more effective further down the stream. Applying those psychometrics as opposed to, once you've got it, whittled it down to 2 employees, right? Potential new hires, applying that at the outset.
Earlier.
Everybody, right? Yeah, a lot earlier. Let's talk about job descriptions. How are job descriptions, what's the state of job descriptions today? What are the challenges? What do we need to do, and how can AI help?
Yeah, so I think we can all agree that job descriptions are generally pretty awful. We are actually
they're depressing to read. I mean, you read them and you're like, oh, I know I'm not right for this, which is often the wrong conclusion to make.
Yeah, exactly. We actually had a great meeting with a company yesterday. and I can, is it okay if I mention them, Brent?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so it's Get Optimal, and they're doing some really fantastic work in this area. But like a tidbit they shared with us that I knew but was outstanding is over 50% of every job description is plagiarized.
Mm,
So basically, every time somebody is looking to kind of create a new job description, what are they doing? They're searching on the internet for similar ones, bringing together pieces of the things they like versus what they don't, and building that job description. In addition, many companies think that they need to hire unicorns instead of salespeople, right? So, they're going to give interesting titles, in terms of like, things like value engineer versus like a, solution consultant or something of that nature that is more common.
mm,
And, and what we find is when we ingest those job descriptions, we find we take about 68 different variables within a job description and evaluate that to see how we can make that more responsive through SEO and through kind of the placement. And what we find is when we eliminate all the jargon, the
mhm.
job description performs much better and people actually apply for it, right? So it's not the unicorn. It's, we're actually looking for a salesperson, but it's a salesperson for a tech company and not Walmart, right? And being able to make that distinction. And sometimes the way job descriptions are written, it isn't that easy to actually tell the difference.
Yeah.
So so it's really important, I think, to that. But then the other part of it is really the bias of who applies.
Mhm,
And I think there's a lot of great work going on in this area. But like women will not apply for a job unless they feel like they are 100% hitting every single area on that job description.
mhm,
Whereas men will apply when they feel like they're 60% ready.
hmm.
I'm ready enough, I'm going to take that step. A lot of that is about the construction of the job description, too long, too many bulleted requirements, and the language that's in that job description. And that it can go more masculine, more feminine. It may actually, completely not at all have any impact on a woman who will say, I don't want that job at all,
Mhm.
just given maybe a couple of words within there. So there's a lot of room for change. And it's exciting to see vendors who are coming to the table and taking the data that's available to be able to say, this needs to be less biased language. We need to remove kind of gendered language from here. And then we also need to think about streamlining this description so that more people will apply. And it's amazing to see the behavior applied to that when you actually put that into the market and you can see the changes in how people respond to them.
Sorry, I was getting excited there.
That's
Great
okay.
point, because and I'm looking at the time. We do need to sort of land the plane here, but and I knew this conversation would go this way. I knew that we'd run out of time, but you're talking about D&I. I mean, this, so there's all sorts of ways that an organization can equip itself to be better at D&I, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of those, excuse me, it's D E and I now, excuse me. But one of those ways is, excuse me, a number of these ways may not have been readily apparent at first blush, but one way is to apply AI to your job description writing process, right? Right there. It's interesting, and I have heard these statistics before that you shared in it, and it's very interesting. Um, you know, that is, how do you solve for that? Well, part of that is changing how the job description is written. Also, part of it is just, changing attitudes, or helping women to think, a little bit more, to realize that you can apply for a job even if you're not 100% qualified. But we're getting back to some of that sort of authoritarian language that comes out of job descriptions in general. And whether or not it's necessarily helping any one group to be more represented. It's, even if you just think about the fact, hey, let's make our job description sound less authoritarian. I mean, that in and of itself that sounds great to me. I think that would sound great to anybody. right? So that's another way of looking at it.
Yeah, it definitely is. But I think it's also like, okay, so I want to make my job description more friendly, less authoritarian. But I don't necessarily know based on my own judgment that if I say I'm looking for someone who's a risk taker, like that's going to take 50% of the population and say, no, no, thanks. I need something really stable.
I
And
don't like
that's
risk.
most
Yeah.
important to me right now, right? And when you introduce AI and where you've seen people take action or not into the equation, you can look out for some of those things that are just not so easily identifiable and really be able to make a step forward in that.
Yesterday we had our Global Executive Advisory Council symposium, um, and we had a few folks online. We had a few presentations and some interactive free open forums. And one of the presentations yesterday was around neurodiversity. And this idea of, the world is built around a sort of the neurotypical way of thinking. This gets beyond, gender and all of that. It's just, we're talking about, people on the spectrum that they don't call it Asperger's anymore, but you have, autism light, I guess, would be called Asperger's, and then other people that are farther along the spectrum. But these are neuro, you could call them neuroatypical, but it's the idea of there's a neurodiversity there. And you look at, there's an analogy here, so, or a parallel thing here, right? You just Google the term leadership and all this stuff comes up, right? And your typical person who's on the spectrum isn't necessarily going to be a leader in an organization, but when you use leadership type language in, say, a job description, you may be dissuading people who would possibly be very good to have on your team for specific tasks, like really good, from even applying. Like I don't have it in front of me, but there's data out there that says, that if you have, they're actually, excuse me, it was SAP a while back. They actually decided to, with some intentionality there, they intentionally built some teams that had some neurodiverse people on it, people on the spectrum. And they found that those teams actually performed 30% better, because some of these neurodiverse folks are really, really good at focusing on a task and solving for problems. And so if you don't have them on your team, you may actually be screwing yourself, so you need to, so there's all sorts of people that you dissuade from joining your company, inadvertently do this through the language you're using. And if you apply AI to that challenge, you may find yourself attracting talent that's going to make you better.
Absolutely. And, I really think, and I look at that as inclusion, right?
Yeah.
They talk about like diversity can be seen, but inclusion is felt. And when we think about diversity, there's so many dimensions to it. And when we think about folks who are disabled as well, like they don't necessarily disclose that. Someone may not disclose that they're neurodiverse. They just may keep that to themselves and then not apply. And when you think about how you take all of those dimensions of diversity and apply them to a team, you get such a better outcome. And that's really where one thing that I've talked a lot about with some practitioners is thinking about everybody asks the question, is this a cultural fit? When we really always need to be asking instead, is this a cultural add? And as we think about that, that allows us to open up folks to have different perspectives, different backgrounds, that may not necessarily be like exactly what we were expecting to be the perfect person for that role. And I think it's amazing when we think about how we can take data to be able to help us understand what those nuances are, and then really kind of drive home bringing a truly a workforce that's going to deliver the results and deliver the types of organizations that we all want to work for.
Yeah, and what you just described is sort of a microcosm of this idea that we have our own sort of subjective ideas of what's going to work, and it's not that we're purposely being subjective. It's just we have our limitations as humans, right? And to be able to apply AI to the process to get to more of an objective conclusion that may be more relevant to the future of the organization is always a good thing. We do need to conclude our conversation. This has been fantastic. We should do this again sometime.
I would love that. I really had a great time today, and thank you so much for having me, Brent.
Oh, absolutely. It is our pleasure. Thank you so much, Jen. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.